Hello there, and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Take a moment to settle in, to let the day begin its slow fade behind you. We have time. We have all the time we need. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet room where the night has already fallen? A place where the last light is just draining from the sky? Wherever you are, you're welcome here. Tonight we're going to explore one of history's most enduring mysteries, El Dorado, the golden city that never was. We'll trace the legend from its origins in the mountains of what is now Colombia, through the fever dreams of conquistadors, across jungles and rivers that swallowed entire expeditions. We'll meet the dreamers and the obsessed, the indigenous peoples whose true story was buried beneath European fantasies, and the searchers who gave everything to find a place that existed only in imagination. It's a journey that spans 5 centuries and reaches from the Andes to the Amazon, from royal courts to remote lakes. But don't worry, this isn't going to be a breathless treasure hunt or a tale of horror in the jungle. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through the human story behind the legend, taking our time with each discovery, each dreamer, each moment when the myth shifted shape. By the end, I think you'll find something more valuable than gold, an understanding of why we dream, why we search, and what it means when we finally let go of impossible things. If you enjoy these calm explorations of history's mysteries, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being here, for trusting these quiet hours together. So settle in now, let your shoulders drop. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the weight of the day sink down through your body and into the earth. And let's begin our slow drift through the story of El Dorado, the golden dream that shaped the world. There's nowhere you need to be right now. Nothing you need to solve. Just listen and let the story unfold like gold leaf on water, catching light as it sinks. Every legend begins somewhere, in some moment when truth and imagination first touch. For El Dorado, that moment came in the year 1536, in the newly conquered lands the Spanish called the New Kingdom of Granada. The conquistadors, still drunk on the astonishing wealth they'd found in the Inca and Aztec empires, were hungry for the next great discovery. And in the mountains near what is now Bogotá, they heard something that would echo through centuries, a story about gold, a lake, and a ceremony so rich it seemed to mock the very idea of scarcity. The story came from the Muisca people, one of the many indigenous groups living in the highlands of the eastern Andes. The Spanish heard fragments first, pieces of a ritual that involved a chief, a raft, gold dust, and a sacred lake. Like all stories passing between languages and cultures, especially between conqueror and conquered, the details shifted and blurred, but the core image remained. A man covered entirely in gold, glittering in sunlight, making offerings to powers the Spanish didn't understand and couldn't quite believe. What the conquistadors didn't grasp, what they perhaps couldn't grasp in their fever for wealth, was that they were hearing about something that had already ended. The ceremony they would spend centuries searching for, the ritual that would launch 1,000 expeditions, had likely ceased before the first Spanish boot touched South American soil. The Muisca had been conquered by neighbouring groups decades earlier. Their sacred ceremonies had been disrupted, their political structures fractured. The Spanish were chasing an echo of an echo, a memory of something already lost to time. But this didn't matter to men like Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada, who first heard these stories and whose mind immediately began transforming them into something grander. In his imagination, and in the imaginations of those who would follow, the ceremony became continuous, present tense, happening right now somewhere just beyond the next mountain range. The man covered in gold became a king, then an emperor. The sacred lake became a city. And that city, shimmering in the minds of desperate men, became El Dorado, the golden one, the place where wealth existed in quantities that would shame all the treasures of the old world. This transformation, from religious ceremony to promised land, reveals something essential about how legends grow. They feed on desire. They fill the shape of what we're looking for. The Spanish wanted another Tenochtitlan, another Cusco, another impossible city filled with gold. So that's what the story became, bending like light through water, beautiful and distorted, leading men towards something that had never existed in the form they imagined. And this brings us to something equally remarkable, the fact that there was truth beneath the myth. The Muisca really did have gold. They really did perform ceremonies involving sacred lakes. There really was a ritual of covering a chief in gold dust. But the reality was richer and stranger than simple treasure. It was about cosmology, about maintaining balance between the human world and the divine, about offerings made not from poverty but from abundance carefully gathered, and then, in a gesture the Spanish would never understand, deliberately cast away. To understand El Dorado, we need to understand the Muisca, and to understand the Muisca, we need to see gold as they saw it, not as the Spanish saw it. This requires a shift in perspective that many conquistadors never managed, a recognition that wealth can mean different things to different peoples, that value itself is a kind of language that doesn't always translate. The Muisca Confederation consisted of two main groups, each led by a powerful ruler, the Zipa, who controlled the southern territories around what is now Bogotá, and the Zac, who ruled the northern regions near present-day Tunja. These weren't primitive tribal leaders as Spanish accounts often portrayed them, but sophisticated rulers presiding over a complex society of perhaps 500,000 people. They built their power not through military conquest alone, but through trade, diplomacy, and religious authority. And yes, they had gold, plenty of it, but not in the way the Spanish imagined. The Muisca didn't mine gold themselves. They lived in highlands rich in emeralds and salt, commodities they traded extensively with lowland peoples who did have access to gold deposits. This trade network stretched across the Andes and down into the Amazon basin, a web of exchange that had existed for centuries before the Spanish arrived. The Muisca would trade their salt and emeralds for gold. Then their skilled craftsmen would transform that gold into objects of stunning beauty and spiritual significance. These weren't crude lumps of precious metal, though the Spanish often melted them down to such. Muisca goldsmiths created intricate figures called tunjos, small votive offerings depicting humans, animals, and spiritual beings. They mastered techniques like lost wax casting, creating pieces so delicate they seemed to shimmer within a life. Some tunjos showed people on rafts, perhaps depicting the very ceremony that would inspire the El Dorado legend. Others showed shamans in transformative states, jaguars, eagles, scenes from a spiritual world the Spanish would dismiss as primitive superstition. But here's what matters for our story. The Muisca made these beautiful objects specifically to give them away, to throw them into sacred lakes and bury them in hidden places as offerings to their gods. In their cosmology, certain bodies of water were portals to the divine, places where the boundary between worlds grew thin. Lakes like Guatavita, Siecha, and Tota weren't just geographical features, but sacred spaces requiring respect, reverence, and offerings. Gold, beautiful and incorruptible, was the perfect material for such gifts to the gods. The Spanish saw this practice and understood it only as waste, as primitive people throwing away wealth they were too simple to appreciate. What they missed was the profound sophistication of a culture that could create such beauty specifically for the purpose of letting it go, that understood wealth not as something to hoard but as something that gained its deepest meaning in the giving. The Muisca made gold sacred by making it invisible, by sending it to places human hands couldn't easily reach. In doing so, they created exactly the kind of tantalizing mystery that would drive Europeans mad with desire. This fundamental misunderstanding, this gap between what the Muisca meant and what the Spanish heard, was the crack through which the legend of El Dorado would pour. The Spanish took a spiritual practice, stripped it of context and meaning, and rebuilt it as a promise of unlimited wealth waiting to be taken. They heard about offerings of gold to sacred lakes and imagined lakes whose bottoms must be paved with treasure. They heard about ceremonies involving gold dust and imagined palaces with walls of solid gold. They transformed a people's relationship with the divine into a shopping list for conquest. Lake Guatavita sits in the mountains northeast of Bogotá, a nearly circular body of water cradled in green hills like a mirror reflecting sky. To the Muisca, this wasn't just a lake, but the home of a goddess, a sacred space where the boundary between the earthly and divine dissolved. And it was here, according to accounts the Spanish would later gather from indigenous sources, that the ceremony took place that would birth the legend of the Golden Man. The ritual centered on the investiture of a new chief. A moment of profound transformation when a human being took on semi-divine authority. The preparation for this ceremony was lengthy and elaborate, involving fasting, isolation, and sacred restrictions that prepared the candidate for his new role. When the day finally came, the chief-elect would be stripped of his clothing and covered entirely in sticky resin. Then, standing before his people, he would be dusted with gold powder until he gleamed like a living statue. A human being transformed into something more than human, a bridge between worlds. A raft would be prepared, decorated and laden with offerings, emeralds, worked gold, precious objects representing the wealth and devotion of the people. The Golden Chief would step onto this raft along with 4 principal subjects, each carrying additional offerings. The raft would be pushed out into the lake, moving slowly toward the center, while the shore filled with people singing, playing instruments, creating a wall of sound that rose up the surrounding hills and echoed back from the water. When the raft reached the lake's center, a profound silence would fall. In that silence, the Golden Chief would begin to make his offerings, throwing objects of gold and emerald into the water, watching them sink down toward the goddess dwelling below. His attendants would do the same, a rain of precious objects falling through the dark water, spiraling down to rest in the mud and silt at the lake's bottom. Then the chief himself would dive into the lake, the gold dust washing from his body in clouds of glittering particles, an offering of his very transformation, returning the gold to the goddess who had empowered him. When he emerged, he was no longer the man who had entered the water. He was chief, sacred, and political authority combined. His power confirmed by the goddess herself. The people would celebrate, and the golden dust, along with the offerings of worked gold and emeralds, would remain in the lake, gifts that should never be retrieved, treasure that gained its value precisely by being placed forever beyond human reach. This is the ceremony that Spanish chroniclers would record, though most of them never witnessed it themselves. They were gathering accounts of something that, if it had ever happened exactly this way, had ceased decades before they arrived. The ceremony they described might have been an idealized version, a memory polished smooth by retelling, or it might have been precisely accurate. We'll never know with certainty, because the Spanish conquest shattered the Muisca world before their ceremonies could be properly documented. But the image of the Golden Man, the gilded chief glittering in sunlight, this image had power. It burned itself into Spanish imagination with the intensity of fever. They heard this story and immediately began their transformation of it, stripping away the religious context, the cultural meaning, the specific details of place and time. They kept only the gold, the chief, and the lake. And from these elements they began to build something much larger, much more dangerous, much more seductive than the original ceremony had ever been. And so El Dorado was born, not as a place name but as a description, the Golden One, El Hombre Dorado, later shortened simply to El Dorado. Over time, through the strange alchemy of desire and distance, the name would shift from the man to the place, from a chief to a city, from a ceremony to a kingdom. The Golden Man would become the Golden City, and that city would move, in the imagination of seekers, across the entire northern half of South America, always just beyond the next range of mountains, the next stretch of river, the next impossible journey. Let's pause here and try to imagine what it must have been like for that chief, that actual human being standing on the shore of Lake Guatavita, about to undergo his transformation. Forget for a moment all the centuries of legend that would follow. Forget the Spanish and their obsessions. Try to picture the reality of this moment, the weight of expectation, the spiritual significance, the simple human experience of being at the centre of such a ceremony. The preparation would have taken weeks, perhaps months. The chief-elect would have lived apart from the community, eating only certain foods, speaking only certain words, his entire existence focused on preparing for this singular moment. He would have been instructed in the responsibilities he was about to assume, the sacred knowledge passed down through generations, the delicate balance he would need to maintain between the needs of his people and the demands of the divine. On the morning of the ceremony, he would have bathed, purified himself, spoken prayers we'll never know. Then came the application of the resin, sticky and uncomfortable, covering every inch of his skin from head to foot. Imagine that sensation, the way it would pull at his skin, the strange feeling of being sealed away from the air, and then the gold dust, applied by priests or attendants, adhering to the resin, transforming him inch by inch from a man of flesh to a figure that seemed to glow with inner light. When he looked at his hands, his arms, his reflection in still water, he wouldn't have seen himself anymore. He would have seen something other, something sacred, something that his people needed him to become. This wasn't decoration. This wasn't vanity. This was transformation in the most literal sense, an external change that reflected and enabled an internal one. The gold made visible the invisible shift from mortal to sacred leader, from individual to living embodiment of his people's relationship with the divine. The walk to the raft must have felt strange, moving through space coated in gold, feeling the sun warm the metal on his skin, seeing his people's faces filled with awe and reverence, stepping onto the raft, feeling it shift beneath his weight, knowing that in moments he would be floating on sacred water above the goddess dwelling below. The movement out into the lake, the sounds of celebration fading slightly with distance, the raft's gentle rocking. The other 4 figures with him carrying offerings, each man silent and focused on what was about to occur. And then the centre of the lake, the perfect stillness, the moment of offering. Watching objects of incredible beauty, objects that represented months or years of skilled work, objects embedded with prayers and hopes and sacred purpose, watching these sink into darkness. Feeling the weight of responsibility, knowing that these offerings represented his people's trust, their belief that he could maintain the relationship with the divine that kept their world in balance. Finally, his own immersion, the shocking cold of the water, the sensation of the gold washing away in clouds, seeing it shimmer around him as he dove, as he emerged, as he returned to his merely human form but carrying now the authority granted by the goddess, who had accepted his transformation and his offerings. The return to shore, the celebration, the knowledge that everything had changed, that he was no longer the person who had stepped onto that raft. This was a real person, or perhaps several real people over the course of Muisca history. These ceremonies, however many times they actually occurred, involved actual human beings with hopes and fears, with the normal anxieties and aspirations of anyone taking on profound responsibility. The Spanish would hear about this and see only the gold. But if we can glimpse, even briefly, the human being at the centre of the ceremony, we come closer to understanding what was lost when El Dorado became merely a legend about treasure. The Spanish arrived in Muisca territory in 1536, led by Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, a lawyer turned conquistador driven by the same ambitions that had propelled men across the Atlantic to this strange new world. He and his men had begun their journey from the Caribbean coast, fighting their way up the Magdalena River through jungle and swamp, losing more than half their original force to disease, hostile encounters, and the simple, brutal difficulty of moving armed men through terrain that resisted every step. When they finally climbed out of the lowlands and into the high plateaus of the eastern Andes, they found the Muisca, a sophisticated agricultural society with large populations, organised settlements, and yes, gold. Not streets paved with gold, not palaces with golden walls, but enough worked gold in temples and worn by leaders to reignite the dreams that had driven the Spanish across an ocean. They conquered with brutal efficiency, using the same combination of superior weapons, tactical ruthlessness, and exploitation of existing political tensions that had worked for Cortés in Mexico and Pizarro in Peru. But the gold they found, while significant, wasn't enough. It's never enough for men driven by the dream of unlimited wealth, men who've already imagined themselves returning to Spain rich beyond measure, who've already spent their theoretical treasure in their minds. So they demanded more. They asked their Muisca prisoners and collaborators where the gold came from, where it was hidden, what other sources of wealth existed in these mountains. And the Muisca, whether trying to appease their conquerors or simply answering honestly about their world, told them about the ceremonial offerings, about the sacred lakes, about the gold that had been thrown into water for generations. They told them about Lake Guatavita and the ceremony of the Golden Chief. They told them, in other words, exactly what the Spanish wanted to hear, a story about vast quantities of gold in a place the conquistadors could imagine reaching, claiming, and extracting. Jimenez de Quesada's men made an attempt to drain Lake Guatavita almost immediately. In 1545, less than a decade after their conquest of the Muisca, they cut a notch in the rim of the lake, lowering the water level by perhaps 3 meters. In the exposed mud, they found some worked gold pieces, enough to confirm that the stories were true, that the lake really did contain offerings. But the engineering challenge was beyond their capabilities, and the water level stabilized. The lake kept its secrets, and in keeping them, fed the legend that was already beginning to spread. Because by this time, the story was changing shape. What had begun as accounts of a specific ceremony at a specific lake was becoming something vaguer, more portable, more adaptable to wishful thinking. Other conquistadors, hearing the story second-hand, third-hand, filtered through translation and desire, began to imagine not just offerings in a lake, but a city or kingdom where gold was so common that they covered their chiefs in it for fun, where the very dust beneath your feet might be precious metal. The transformation accelerated because it served a purpose. Conquistadors needed to justify new expeditions, to convince backers and governors that there was still more wealth to find, that the dream wasn't over, that just beyond the next mountain range or river system lay riches that would dwarf everything found so far. El Dorado became the name for that perpetual promise, that endlessly deferred treasure that justified one more expedition, one more journey into the unknown, one more company of men marching into jungle and never returning. And so the myth and the conquistadors met and recognized each other, the way dreams recognize dreamers, the way obsessions find the people whose lives they'll consume. The Muisca had told a true story about their sacred practices. The Spanish heard a treasure map. And in the space between these two understandings, El Dorado was born, a place that never existed but that would shape the real geography of South America through the sheer force of men's belief in it, through the expeditions it would launch, the deaths it would cause, the maps it would corrupt, and the dreams it would both inspire and destroy. Which brings us to the first great expedition in search of El Dorado, a journey that would set the pattern for all the disasters that followed. A story of ambition and suffering that should have ended the legend but instead only made it more seductive, more dangerous, more impossible to resist. Gonzalo Pizarro was the younger brother of Francisco Pizarro, the man who had conquered the Inca Empire and extracted its gold. This meant Gonzalo had seen what was possible, had witnessed the reality of Spanish rumours about golden kingdoms. He knew that sometimes the impossible stories turned out to be true, that sometimes the wildest dreams were actually understated descriptions of New World wealth. This knowledge made him dangerous, to himself and to everyone who would follow him. In 1539, Pizarro was appointed governor of Quito, in what is now Ecuador. Almost immediately he began hearing stories about cinnamon forests and a land of gold somewhere to the east, beyond the Andes, in the direction of the unknown jungle. These rumours mixed elements of truth with wishful thinking. As such rumours always do. There really were cinnamon trees in the eastern foothills. There really were indigenous peoples beyond the mountains who had gold. But the scale, the accessibility, the promise of easy wealth, these were products of imagination rather than reality. Pizarro assembled an enormous expedition, approximately 220 Spanish soldiers, 4,000 indigenous porters and servants, numerous African slaves, 200 horses, thousands of pigs and llamas for food, hundreds of dogs for hunting and war. This wasn't a scouting party, but an army, a mobile colony prepared to conquer whatever wealth it found. The scale of the expedition reflected both Pizarro's ambition and his confidence that success was certain, that somewhere in the green darkness beyond the mountains, El Dorado waited. They departed Quito in February 1541, on a journey that should have taken months, but would drag on for nearly 2 years of suffering that survivors would remember with horror for the rest of their lives. The route took them up over the Andes and down into the Amazon basin, into terrain that resisted every advance, that seemed designed to consume Spanish expeditions and leave nothing behind but scattered bones and rusted metal. The mountains were brutal enough, but manageable for men who'd already crossed the Andes multiple times. It was the descent into the jungle that broke them. The trail, such as it was, disappeared entirely. They cut their way through undergrowth so thick that progress was measured in meters per day rather than kilometers. The rain fell constantly, a grey curtain that turned everything to mud, that rotted clothing and rusted metal and made dry camps impossible. Disease spread through the indigenous porters and slaves, fevers, dysentery, infections from scratches that wouldn't heal in the constant damp. The food ran out faster than anticipated. The llamas and pigs, so carefully shepherded over the mountains, began to die or wander off or simply sink into the mud and refuse to rise. The indigenous porters, pressed into service under threat, began to desert when they could. To slip away into the forest and try to find their way home. Some were caught and killed as examples. Others vanished successfully, choosing the risk of unknown forest over the certainty of continued suffering under Pizarro's command. And the cinnamon, when they finally found it, was worthless. The trees existed, true enough, but the cinnamon they produced was inferior in quality and impossible to harvest in commercial quantities. The forest didn't offer its resources to armed men in a hurry. The trees grew scattered and inaccessible, their bark requiring careful processing that the expedition had no capability to perform. The dream of cinnamon wealth, one of the lures that had justified this entire journey, collapsed into nothing within weeks of reaching the supposed cinnamon country. But Pizarro pressed on, because he had to, because turning back without finding El Dorado would mean admitting failure, would mean all this suffering had been for nothing. They followed rivers eastward, moving deeper into the Amazon basin, travelling through lands where no European had ever been, where the indigenous peoples had never seen horses or steel, or men with pale skin and incomprehensible ambitions. Some villages welcomed them, offered them food, told them yes, there was gold further on, always further on, perhaps just trying to persuade the strange armed visitors to leave. Other villages fought them, attacking from the forest with arrows and spears, harassing the Spanish column, adding combat casualties to the growing toll from disease and starvation. As the expedition struggled deeper into the jungle, as their supplies dwindled and their men died, Pizarro made a decision that would split his force and lead to one of the most remarkable accidental discoveries in the age of exploration. He ordered his second-in-command, Francisco de Orellana, to take the strongest men and push ahead in a newly constructed brigantine boat to search for food and navigate downriver to find a place where the expedition could resupply. Orellana departed with approximately 50 men in December 1541, expecting to rejoin Pizarro within days or at most weeks. He would never see his commander again. Orellana's small force moved swiftly downriver, covering in days what would have taken Pizarro's struggling land expedition weeks. But as they travelled, the river grew larger, wider, more powerful. The current strengthened until turning back became not just difficult, but genuinely impossible. They tried, according to Orellana's later account, but the water moved too fast. Their boat was too small and poorly provisioned for such a struggle against the flow. They faced a choice: continue downriver into the absolute unknown, or beach the boat and try to fight their way back through the jungle on foot, which would almost certainly mean death for all of them. They continued downriver, and in doing so became the first Europeans to traverse the Amazon River from the Andes to the Atlantic. It was an astonishing achievement, an accidental epic that would take them 8 months, cover approximately 4,800 kilometers, and bring them into contact with indigenous peoples and ecosystems that had existed in complete isolation from European knowledge. Orellana's chaplain and chronicler, Gaspar de Carvajal, kept a journal that remains one of our primary sources for the pre-conquest Amazon, describing large settled villages, extensive agriculture, complex societies that would be devastated by European diseases in the coming decades. Carvajal also recorded stories they heard along the river, tales told by indigenous peoples about lands and kingdoms further away, rumours of wealth and wonder that fed back into the El Dorado legend even as Orellana's men struggled simply to survive. They heard about women warriors, fierce fighters who lived in communities without men, a story that would lead Orellana to name the river the Amazon after the legendary female warriors of classical mythology. They heard about tribes with vast wealth, about regions where gold was common, about kingdoms in the interior that rivaled anything in the Old World. These stories, like the stories that had launched Pizarro's expedition, mixed truth with misunderstanding, indigenous people's actual knowledge with things they told these strange visitors to impress them, or frighten them, or encourage them to move along. But Orellana and his men, half-starved and desperately trying to stay alive long enough to reach the Atlantic, had no way to investigate these rumours. They noted them in the journal and kept moving, kept surviving, kept riding the great river toward a distant ocean they weren't certain even existed in the direction they were travelling. Meanwhile, Pizarro and the main expedition, abandoned though Pizarro didn't yet know it, continued their suffering march through the jungle. They waited for Orellana to return with supplies, with news, with hope. They waited until waiting became obviously futile, until they had to accept that Orellana wasn't coming back, that they'd been reduced to their own resources in the heart of the greatest rainforest on Earth. The return journey was if anything more horrific than the outbound march. They had no supplies, no pack animals, no illusions left about finding El Dorado. They ate their remaining horses, then their dogs, then whatever they could forage from the forest. Men died daily from starvation, disease, exposure, or simple despair. Of the original 4,000 or so indigenous porters and servants who had departed Quito, only a handful returned. Of the 200-plus Spanish soldiers, fewer than 80 survived. The expedition that had departed in glory and ambition limped back to Quito in June 1542, 16 months after leaving, having found nothing but suffering and death. Pizarro blamed Orellana for the disaster, claiming his lieutenant had deliberately abandoned the expedition rather than simply being carried away by an impossible current. The charge was probably unfair, but it didn't matter. Both men had survived, which made them more fortunate than thousands who'd followed them into the jungle. And neither had found El Dorado, which meant the legend remained intact, undisproven, waiting for the next dreamer who thought he could succeed where Pizarro had failed. If Pizarro's expedition represents ambitious failure, the story of Lope de Aguirre represents what happens when failure curdles into madness, when disappointment transforms into rage against the world itself. Aguirre's expedition in search of El Dorado, launched in 1560, would end not just in failure but in rebellion, murder, and a descent into violence that shocked even the violent world of the conquistadors. Aguirre was a minor conquistador, a man of low birth and high resentment, someone who'd spent decades in the New World fighting for other men's fortunes, nursing grievances against the colonial system that denied him the wealth and status he believed he deserved. When Pedro de Ursua organised an expedition to search for El Dorado in the unmapped interior of South America, Aguirre signed on, but from the beginning his participation was as much about settling old scores as finding new gold. The expedition departed from Peru with approximately 300 Spanish soldiers and hundreds of indigenous servants, following rivers east through the Andes and into the Amazon basin. Ursua was inexperienced as a leader, more interested in his mistress than in managing his men, and resentment built quickly. The expedition made poor progress, supplies ran low, men began to die from the usual causes, disease and starvation, and the simple grinding difficulty of moving through jungle that resisted every advance. Aguirre began to plot, gathering malcontents, whispering sedition, building a coalition of men who shared his grievances against Spanish colonial authority. On New Year's Day, 1561, the conspirators struck, murdering Ursua in his tent. Declaring the expedition free from Spanish royal control, they elected one of their own, Fernando de Guzman, as their new leader, calling him prince of a kingdom that existed only in their fevered imaginations. But Aguirre wasn't interested in following another leader, even one the rebels had chosen themselves. Over the following months, as the expedition continued its chaotic drift down river, Aguirre systematically murdered anyone who might challenge his authority. Guzman was killed. Loyalists were killed. Men who questioned Aguirre's decisions were killed. His own lieutenant and friend, who dared to suggest moderation, was killed. The expedition became a floating kingdom of terror, with Aguirre as its mad king, styling himself the wrath of God and the prince, writing insane letters to King Philip II of Spain declaring his rebellion and his intention to conquer all of Peru. Any pretense of searching for El Dorado was abandoned. The expedition moved downriver simply to move, to stay ahead of pursuers, to find somewhere Aguirre could establish his mad kingdom. They raided indigenous villages for supplies, killing without discrimination, leaving a trail of destruction through communities that had done nothing to deserve such violence. When they finally reached the mouth of the Amazon and turned west along the coast toward Venezuela, they were no longer an expedition but a roving band of murderers held together by fear of their leader and the certainty that the Spanish authorities would execute them all if captured. In Venezuela, Aguirre's tiny kingdom finally collapsed. His men began to desert, slipping away to surrender to Spanish authorities and beg for mercy. Aguirre, seeing the end approaching, murdered his own daughter, rather than leave her to face the consequences of his rebellion. When Spanish soldiers finally cornered him, his own remaining men turned on him, killing him to prove their loyalty and hoping for lenient treatment. Aguirre's body was quartered, the pieces displayed in different towns as a warning against rebellion. His head was placed in an iron cage in the main square of Valencia, where it remained for years, a grim memorial to what happened when the search for El Dorado curdled into madness and rage. The expedition had found no gold, discovered no golden city, achieved nothing but a long list of murders and an enduring legend of horror. And yet the story of Aguirre's madness, far from discouraging future searches for El Dorado, seemed almost to add to the legend's allure. If El Dorado could drive men to such extremes, the thinking went, it must be real, must be worth the suffering and death. The legend fed on its failures, grew stronger with each disaster, became more seductive precisely because it remained unfound. Across the Atlantic in Elizabethan England, a courtier and adventurer named Walter Raleigh was building his own obsession with El Dorado, an obsession that would shape the last decades of his life and ultimately contribute to his execution. Raleigh's engagement with the legend was different from the Spanish conquistadors, filtered through English nationalism, Protestant rivalry with Catholic Spain, and a very English combination of commercial ambition and chivalric romanticism. Raleigh first heard detailed accounts of El Dorado in the 1580s, as reports of Spanish expeditions filtered back to Europe. He read everything he could find about the New World, studied Spanish and Portuguese accounts, interviewed sailors and adventurers who'd travelled to South America. He became convinced that El Dorado existed, that it was located in Guyana, the region south of the Orinoco River in what is now Venezuela, and that England could claim it before Spain, striking a blow against English's great rival, while enriching the realm and covering himself in glory. This conviction wasn't entirely unreasonable given the information available to him. The Spanish themselves believed in El Dorado, had launched multiple expeditions to find it, spoke of it in their reports and correspondence. Indigenous peoples consistently mentioned wealthy kingdoms in the interior, though whether these mentions referred to actual places or were attempts to send conquistadors elsewhere is impossible to determine at this distance. The legend had enough supporting evidence, enough second-hand accounts and plausible details, to convince even careful observers that the Golden City might truly exist. Raleigh's first expedition to Guyana departed England in February 1595, with 5 ships and approximately 100 men. His stated goal was to locate El Dorado, establish friendly relations with indigenous peoples opposed to Spanish rule, and ideally claim the Golden City for England and Queen Elizabeth. The Queen herself had given the expedition cautious support. Intrigued by the possibility of wealth and strategic advantage but unwilling to commit significant resources to what might be merely a fantasy. They arrived on the coast of what is now Venezuela, and began the difficult process of navigating the Orinoco River and its tributaries, searching for the Golden City that indigenous informants consistently placed just a bit further inland, always beyond the next river bend or mountain range. Raleigh's account of this expedition, published in 1596 as the discovery of the large, rich and beautiful empire of Guyana, reads like a fascinating mixture of careful observation, wishful thinking, and deliberate exaggeration designed to secure funding for future expeditions. He described conversations with indigenous leaders who spoke of a wealthy kingdom called Manoa, ruled by a king descended from the Incas who'd fled Peru during the Spanish conquest. This king, Raleigh's informant said, covered himself in gold dust daily, washing it off each evening in a sacred lake, an echo of the original Muisca ceremony transformed and relocated to fit Guyana geography. The kingdom of Manoa was said to contain a city so wealthy that its buildings were roofed with gold, its streets were lined with golden statues, its warriors fought with golden weapons. Raleigh explored the Orinoco extensively, travelling further into the interior than most Europeans had ventured, encountering indigenous peoples and gathering accounts of lands further inland. He found some gold, though not in the quantities he'd hoped for, not in the massive deposits that would justify calling a place El Dorado. He made contact with indigenous leaders who seemed genuinely friendly, who spoke of their hatred for the Spanish and their willingness to ally with England. He gathered samples of gold ore, wrote detailed notes about the landscape and peoples, and returned to England convinced that El Dorado existed and that he'd been close, so close to finding it. His book about the expedition was a bestseller, feeding English appetite for New World adventure and Spanish discomfiture. He described Guyana in glowing terms, calling it a land of opportunity where English enterprise could build a profitable colony and strike a blow against Spanish dominance in the New World. He dedicated the book to Lord Howard and Sir Robert Cecil, powerful men who might support future expeditions. And throughout the text he returned again and again to the theme of El Dorado, the Golden City waiting to be claimed, the opportunity to enrich England and humble Spain in one glorious discovery. But convincing the Queen to fund a larger expedition proved difficult. Elizabeth was cautious about antagonizing Spain without clear benefit, and Raleigh's evidence for El Dorado, compelling though it seemed to him, wasn't enough to justify a major investment. He returned to his other pursuits, his political manoeuvring, his privateering against Spanish shipping, his scientific interests and literary patronage. But the dream of Guyana stayed with him, a persistent fantasy that would wait decades for another chance at realization. Let's return to that first expedition of 1595 and look more closely at what Raleigh actually experienced, what he saw and heard that convinced him El Dorado was real and findable. Understanding his evidence helps us understand both the power of the legend and the tragic gap between what seekers hoped to find and what was actually there to be discovered. Raleigh and his men spent months exploring the Orinoco River system, a vast network of waterways draining the interior highlands of Guyana. The river landscape amazed them, waters that changed colour with the season, dense forests coming right to the water's edge, wildlife they'd never imagined, indigenous peoples with complex cultures and extensive knowledge of the region. This was terra incognita in the most literal sense, unmapped territory where European knowledge had barely penetrated, where almost anything might exist beyond the next river bend. The indigenous peoples Raleigh encountered told him consistent stories about wealthy kingdoms inland, though consistency doesn't necessarily mean accuracy. They might have been telling the truth as they understood it, passing along stories they'd heard from other groups about places further away. They might have been telling Raleigh what he obviously wanted to hear, a survival strategy when dealing with armed strangers. Or they might have been deliberately sending the English away from their own territories, pointing toward lands held by enemies, or simply toward empty space on the indigenous mental map. Raleigh heard about Manoa, the golden city supposedly founded by Inca refugees who'd fled Pizarro's conquest of Peru. The story had a certain plausibility. The Inca Empire had been vast, and surely some nobles and priests must have escaped the Spanish conquest, taking their wealth with them into remote regions where they could rebuild their civilization. The idea of an Inca kingdom in hiding, maintaining the old ways, accumulating gold as the original empire had done, this resonated with European romantic notions while seeming to rest on a foundation of historical possibility. He gathered samples of gold ore, evidence that the region contained gold deposits worth exploiting. But ore isn't El Dorado, isn't a city with golden buildings, isn't even necessarily profitable given the difficulty of extraction and transport. Still, the gold was real, which gave credence to stories about wealthy kingdoms, which fed Raleigh's conviction that he was on the right track, that he just needed to push a bit further, explore a bit more thoroughly, and the golden city would reveal itself. The natural abundance of the region impressed him deeply. The forests were rich with valuable woods, the rivers teemed with fish. The land was clearly fertile and capable of supporting large populations. This wasn't barren wilderness, but a landscape of plenty, which made the existence of wealthy kingdoms seem more plausible. In Raleigh's mind, such abundant land must support prosperous peoples, and prosperous peoples must accumulate wealth, and wealthy peoples in possession of gold would naturally build golden cities. Each logical step seemed reasonable, leading to a conclusion that felt inevitable even though it rested on assumptions rather than evidence. He met indigenous leaders who seemed to confirm that kingdoms existed further inland, places his expedition hadn't reached, places that required more men, more supplies, more time to locate. He took these confirmations at face value, writing them down carefully, presenting them as evidence to be evaluated alongside the gold ore and his own observations of the landscape. What he couldn't see, or perhaps chose not to see, was that every step of exploration revealed no El Dorado, that the Golden City remained forever at the limit of investigation, always just beyond reach. The expedition returned to the coast, and then to England, having lost only 2 men, a remarkable achievement given the usual casualties of such journeys. They brought back gold ore worth perhaps £1,000, enough to defray some costs but nowhere near enough to cover expenses or provide the windfall Raleigh had hoped for. They brought back maps of the Orinoco, descriptions of indigenous peoples, samples of plants and animals, knowledge that expanded European understanding of South American geography. But they didn't bring back El Dorado, didn't find the Golden City, didn't fulfill the expedition's primary goal, and yet Raleigh considered the expedition a success because he'd found evidence. Or what he interpreted as evidence that El Dorado existed and could be located with more resources and time. He'd found enough gold to prove the region contained wealth. He'd heard enough stories to confirm that wealthy kingdoms existed inland. He'd explored enough territory to narrow down where El Dorado might be. In his mind, he'd made progress toward a goal that remained achievable, that required merely persistence and proper support. This is how obsessions sustain themselves, how quests survive failure, by redefining success, by treating evidence of absence as merely insufficient evidence of presence, by maintaining faith that the next attempt will succeed where previous attempts fell short. Raleigh would wait more than 20 years for his next chance to search for El Dorado, but the dream never faded, never lost its golden glow, never stopped whispering that it was real, it was findable, it was waiting for the man brave and persistent enough to claim it. One of the most remarkable aspects of the El Dorado legend is how it moved. As explorers investigated one region and found no golden city, the legend simply relocated to another unmapped area, maintaining its promise while evading every attempt at verification. This geographic flexibility reveals something profound about how myths operate, how they adapt to preserve themselves, how they feed on the unknown spaces between human knowledge. Initially, as we've seen, El Dorado was associated with Lake Guatavita and the Muisca territory in the highlands of modern Colombia. But once that region was thoroughly explored and conquered, once the Spanish had squeezed what wealth they could from the Muisca and confirmed that no golden city existed there, the legend migrated eastward, into the unmapped vastness beyond the Andes, into the Amazon basin and the Orinoco watershed. This migration followed a logical pattern. El Dorado always existed just beyond the frontier of European knowledge, in the blank spaces on maps, in regions that remained hypothetical rather than described. As each blank space was explored and failed to yield a golden city, the legend moved to the next blank space, the next unmapped river system, the next mountain range that European eyes hadn't seen. The legend was like water, filling whatever geographical container remained empty. By the late 1500s and early 1600s, El Dorado had become associated with various interior regions of northern South America. Guyana, as Raleigh believed, the upper Amazon basin, the lands around Lake Parima, a body of water that appeared on numerous maps but whose existence was entirely hypothetical. Each location had its champions, explorers who'd heard stories from indigenous informants or who'd reasoned from geographical features that this region must be the true location of the Golden City. The existence of Lake Parima demonstrates how the legend could create geography rather than merely occupying it. European cartographers, working from second-hand accounts and pure speculation, placed this enormous lake in the interior of South America, roughly where the borders of Venezuela, Brazil and Guyana now meet. The lake appeared on maps for more than 2 centuries, depicted with varying shapes and sizes but always present, always waiting for explorers to visit and confirm its existence. Expeditions searched for Lake Parima, followed rivers they hoped would lead to its shores, interrogated indigenous guides about the route to the great inland lake. The fact that no expedition ever found it didn't disprove its existence, merely confirmed that the correct route remained undiscovered. The legend fed on the failure to find it. If Lake Parima didn't exist, why did so many indigenous peoples speak of it? If there was no Great Lake, why did Spanish, English, Dutch, and Portuguese explorers all report hearing about it? The answer, invisible to contemporary seekers, was that indigenous peoples had their own reasons for mentioning non-existent places. Perhaps they were reporting second- or third-hand stories about real lakes that existed elsewhere and got relocated in translation. Perhaps they were deliberately sending Europeans away from territories the indigenous peoples wanted to protect. Perhaps they were simply confused by what Europeans were asking for, giving answers that aligned with European expectations rather than indigenous knowledge. The shifting geography of El Dorado also reflected European wishful thinking about what South America's interior must contain. The continent was vast, much of it unexplored from a European perspective. It seemed impossible that such a huge area contained nothing but jungle and savanna, and scattered indigenous groups. Surely there must be kingdoms comparable to the Aztec and Inca empires that the Spanish had already conquered. Surely all this unmapped space must hide something spectacular, something worth the suffering required to reach it. This assumption, that geographic space implies corresponding wealth, shows how poorly Europeans understood the New World even after decades of exploration. They projected Old World patterns onto New World landscapes, expecting to find centralized kingdoms and accumulated wealth in every region they explored. They couldn't imagine, or refused to imagine, that vast areas might be inhabited by peoples who'd chosen different paths of development, who'd created sophisticated cultures without building the kind of monumental architecture and accumulated gold that Europeans recognized as signs of civilization. So El Dorado moved through the unmapped spaces of South America like a roomer searching for a home, settling temporarily in each blank spot on the map until exploration filled that space with actual knowledge, then relocating to the next unknown region. The legend was nomadic, migratory, always staying just ahead of verification, always promising that the next expedition would be the one to succeed where all previous expeditions had failed. The mapmakers of the 16th and 17th centuries played a crucial role in perpetuating the El Dorado legend, giving geographic reality to places that existed only in imagination and hope. Maps don't just record what's known, they also shape expectations about what might be discovered, creating visual arguments for the existence of things not yet verified. And in the case of El Dorado, maps became wish fulfillment, speculation presented as fact, dreams rendered in ink and parchment. Consider the challenges facing a European cartographer trying to map South America in, say, 1590. The continent's coastline was reasonably well known, documented by decades of expeditions and colonial settlement. Major rivers like the Amazon and Orinoco had been explored at least partially, their mouths and lower reaches plotted with decent accuracy, but the interior, the vast majority of the continent's land area, remained almost completely unknown to Europeans. A cartographer couldn't just leave this space blank. Maps were commercial products sold to merchants, nobles, governments, anyone with interest in the New World and money to spend on detailed geographical information. A map with huge blank areas looked incomplete, unprofessional, worthless. Customers wanted maps that showed everything, that provided comprehensive geographical knowledge, that turned the unknown into the known through the magic of confident lines and labels. So cartographers filled the blank spaces with the best information they had, which often meant second-hand accounts from explorers, stories gathered from indigenous informants, geographical speculation based on what seemed likely. If an explorer reported hearing about a great lake in the interior, the cartographer would draw a lake, estimate its size and position, and label it based on whatever name the explorer had provided. If multiple reports mentioned the same feature, even if the reports were vague and contradictory, the cartographer would synthesize them into a single feature, depicted with false precision. Lake Parima appeared on maps this way, drawn as an enormous inland lake surrounded by mountains, sometimes circular, sometimes elongated, sometimes with islands, always positioned approximately where modern Guyana, Venezuela, and Brazil meet. Different maps showed it in different configurations, but its presence was consistent, a cartographic feature that seemed to have the same reality as the Andes or the Amazon River. On the shores of this hypothetical lake, some maps placed the Golden City itself, Manoa or El Dorado, or some variant name, rendered as a cluster of buildings suggesting urban settlement, sometimes accompanied by symbols indicating wealth or political importance. The city had become geography, a place you could point to on a map, a destination you could plan a route toward. The fact that no one had actually been there didn't matter. The map said it existed, which was a kind of proof, a visual argument that seemed to confirm the legend. Other maps showed the supposed route to El Dorado, rivers leading inland from the coast, mountain passes threading through the Andes, trails marked as though they'd been verified by actual travellers. These routes were speculative, extrapolated from partial knowledge and hopeful assumptions, but they appeared on maps with the same confident lines as routes that had been thoroughly documented. A reader comparing coastal routes, which were accurate, with interior routes, which were fantasy, would have no way to distinguish verified from imagined unless they read the very small print of cartographic legends and disclaimers. The cartographers weren't deliberately lying, at least not most of them. They were trying to synthesize all available information into coherent geographical representation, filling gaps in knowledge with educated guesses. But the effect of their work was to give El Dorado a false solidity, to make it seem more real than it was, to transform rumour and wishful thinking into apparent geographical fact. These maps circulated widely, copied and recopied, each generation of map makers relying on previous maps as sources, perpetuating errors and speculation through repetition. If cartographer A drew Lake Parima based on an explorer's vague report, and cartographer B copied Lake Parima from A's map without independent verification, and cartographer C then copied it from B's map, by the time we reach cartographer C, the lake seems well established, confirmed by multiple sources. A standard feature of South American geography. This process created a feedback loop where maps influenced explorers, and explorers influenced maps in ways that reinforced belief in El Dorado, rather than critically evaluating it. An explorer planning an expedition might consult maps showing Lake Parima and El Dorado, treat those as destination targets, and then report on attempts to reach them. The very act of searching for these features, even if the search failed, seemed to confirm that the features existed, that the searchers simply hadn't found the right route yet. The situation wasn't corrected until the late 18th and early 19th centuries, when scientific expeditions began systematically mapping South America's interior using careful surveys rather than speculation. These expeditions gradually filled the blank spaces with actual knowledge, confirming that Lake Parima didn't exist, that the Golden City wasn't waiting on its shores, that centuries of maps had depicted a geographic fantasy. But by then, enormous resources had been spent searching for El Dorado, countless lives lost, indigenous populations devastated by contact with expeditions passing through their territories. The maps had made the legend more dangerous by giving it apparent geographical substance, by turning a story about a ceremony into a place that seemed to have location and reality and the solidity of cartographic authority. Walter Raleigh's second and final expedition to search for El Dorado came more than 20 years after his first attempt, launched under circumstances so desperate that failure meant not just disappointment, but death. By 1617, when Raleigh organised this expedition, he was no longer the favoured courtier he'd been under Queen Elizabeth. Elizabeth had died in 1603, and her successor James I actively disliked Raleigh, considering him politically dangerous and too antagonistic towards Spain, with whom James sought peaceful relations. Raleigh had been imprisoned in the Tower of London since 1603 on dubious charges of treason, spending 13 years in confinement while the world changed around him. His imprisonment would have been longer, probably permanent, except that he managed to convince James that El Dorado really existed, that he knew where to find it, that one more expedition would return with enough gold to enrich the crown and fund James's various expensive projects. It was a desperate pitch from a desperate man. And James's willingness to listen reflected the king's own financial problems. James released Raleigh on the strict condition that the expedition must not attack Spanish territories or shipping, must find gold without antagonizing Spain, must essentially perform the impossible task of extracting wealth from regions Spain claimed as its own, without technically violating Spanish sovereignty. Raleigh assembled a fleet of 14 ships and approximately 1,000 men. a substantial force but one operating under impossible constraints. He was 64 years old, in poor health after years of imprisonment, pursuing a dream that had eluded him for decades. His crew included his son Walter, called Wat, whose presence added both motivation and risk. Raleigh was wagering not just his own life, but his son's life on the truth of El Dorado. The fleet departed England in June 1617, crossing the Atlantic and making landfall on the South American coast in November. By then, Raleigh was seriously ill, possibly with malaria, unable to lead the expedition personally inland as he'd done 20 years earlier. He sent a party under the command of Lawrence Keymis, his loyal lieutenant, with instructions to sail up the Orinoco, locate the gold mine Raleigh claimed to have discovered on his first expedition, and return with samples that would prove El Dorado's existence. Keymis sailed upriver with approximately 400 men, including young Wat Raleigh. The expedition was a disaster from the start. They found no gold mine because no gold mine existed in the location Raleigh remembered or thought he remembered. They did encounter a Spanish settlement called San Tomé, which according to their strict orders they were supposed to avoid. But someone fired shots, the situation escalated, and the English stormed the town, burning it and killing several Spanish defenders. Young Wat Raleigh died in the assault on San Tomé, killed by a Spanish musket ball. The expedition's second in command, also named Raleigh, was killed the same night. Keymis, realizing the disaster he'd created, withdrew downriver without the gold that was supposed to justify everything. When he returned to the coast and reported to Raleigh, having failed to find gold, having broken explicit orders not to fight the Spanish, having lost Raleigh's son and namesake, the weight of failure was too much. Keymis shot himself, adding one more death to the expedition's toll. Raleigh was shattered. His son was dead, his lieutenant was dead, the expedition had found no gold, and they'd given King James the perfect excuse to hand Raleigh over to Spanish demands for justice. The other ship's captains, seeing the situation, began to desert, sailing away to pursue privateering, or simply to escape being associated with Raleigh's certain punishment. The grand expedition dissolved into chaos and recrimination. Raleigh sailed back to England knowing he was sailing to his death. He could have fled to France, where the English crown's authority didn't reach, but he chose to return and face judgment, perhaps from a sense of aristocratic duty, perhaps from despair after losing his son, perhaps from the naive hope that James might show mercy. He arrived in Plymouth in June 1618, was immediately arrested, and was taken to London to face charges. James was under tremendous pressure from Spain, which demanded Raleigh's execution for the attack on San Tomé. The king needed to appease Spain to maintain his preferred foreign policy of peace and alliance. Raleigh's original treason conviction from 1603, for which he'd never been formally pardoned, provided the legal mechanism. James simply reactivated the old sentence. On October 29, 1618, Walter Raleigh was beheaded in Old Palace Yard, Westminster. He was 66 years old, had spent much of his adult life obsessed with finding El Dorado, and died having failed completely, having lost his son to that failure, having spent his final months knowing that the golden city he'd believed in so deeply had betrayed him with its non-existence. His last words, spoken to the executioner hesitating at the axe, were allegedly, quote, 0. Let's pause here and consider what Walter Raleigh's life and death tell us about the nature of obsession. About what happens when we commit ourselves entirely to a dream that can't be realised. Raleigh was not a fool. He was intelligent, educated, sophisticated, a poet and historian and scientist as well as an explorer and courtier. His belief in El Dorado wasn't simple-minded greed, but a complex mixture of ambition, nationalism, genuine curiosity about the world, and a kind of romantic faith in the possibility of wonder. He'd read everything available about the New World. He'd personally explored significant portions of South America. He'd interviewed indigenous peoples, gathered physical evidence in the form of gold ore, studied maps and reports from Spanish expeditions. His belief in El Dorado wasn't baseless fantasy, but a conclusion drawn from what seemed like substantial evidence, filtered through both his own observations and the larger cultural assumptions of his era about what the New World must contain. But somewhere along the way, perhaps gradually or perhaps in a specific moment of decision we can't trace, his investigation of El Dorado transformed into belief in El Dorado, and belief hardened into conviction that couldn't accommodate contrary evidence. This is the dangerous transition every obsession makes, the point where we stop testing our beliefs against reality and instead filter reality through our beliefs, seeing only what confirms what we've already decided must be true. The gold ore he found proved in his mind that the region contained gold and therefore must contain El Dorado. When the Golden City didn't appear where he expected, this proved only that he'd searched the wrong area, not that the city didn't exist. When indigenous informants told him about wealthy kingdoms inland, he took these reports as confirmation. When other informants contradicted these stories or when expeditions found nothing, he attributed this to poor translation, deliberately misleading informants, or insufficient exploration. Every failure became a reason to try again rather than a reason to question the fundamental assumption. This pattern of thought is recognizable to anyone who's watched conspiracy theories operate or who's struggled with their own obsessions. Once we've committed to a belief, once we've invested time and energy and reputation in pursuing it, admitting we were wrong becomes psychologically almost impossible. The mind constructs elaborate explanations for why the belief remains true despite apparent evidence to the contrary. Each failed test of the belief becomes, paradoxically, evidence of how carefully the truth is hidden, how much effort will be required to reveal it. For Raleigh, the stakes were even higher because he'd convinced powerful people to support his quest, had led men into danger based on his convictions, had staked his reputation and eventually his life on being right about El Dorado. To admit he was wrong would mean accepting that all the suffering, all the deaths, all the resources spent had been for nothing, in pursuit of a fantasy. That's a weight few people can bear, especially not someone with Raleigh's pride and sense of destiny. So he doubled down, again and again, each time the evidence failed to support his belief. He wrote books presenting El Dorado as fact. He organised a second expedition when by any rational measure the first expedition's failure should have ended his search. He risked his son's life, watching Watt sail upriver toward a golden city that existed only in his father's imagination. And when Watt died, when the expedition failed completely, when the weight of consequences could no longer be avoided, Raleigh still couldn't quite let go of the dream. In his final months, imprisoned and awaiting execution, he continued to insist that El Dorado existed, that given another chance he could find it, that the failure of his expeditions proved nothing except that the city was well hidden and required more resources, more time, better luck to locate. Perhaps this was self-delusion to the end. Or perhaps it was a kind of defensive mechanism, a way to maintain dignity in the face of total failure by insisting that the dream had been worthy even if he hadn't been able to achieve it. His execution was, in a sense, the death of El Dorado's most famous English champion, but it wasn't the death of the legend itself. Other seekers would follow, other expeditions would search, other maps would show the golden city waiting to be found. The legend was bigger than any individual believer, resilient enough to survive each person's failure and each generation's disappointment. But Raleigh's story marks a turning point in the legend's history, a moment when at least some observers began to question whether El Dorado was real, or whether it was, as one contemporary put it, a castle in the air built from clouds and wishes. The death of such a prominent seeker, having failed so completely, having lost so much, suggested that perhaps the dream itself was the problem. That perhaps the real treasure was accepting that some things we desire don't exist and weren't worth pursuing in the first place. While seekers like Raleigh searched for El Dorado in distant, unexplored regions, some investigators returned to where the legend began, Lake Guatavita in the highlands of Colombia. If the story of the Golden Man was true, if the ceremony had really involved throwing gold into the sacred lake, then the lake bed must contain the offerings of centuries. Drain the lake, these practical-minded dreamers thought, and you'd find not a city of gold, but at least a fortune in worked gold and emeralds waiting to be recovered. We've already mentioned the first attempt in 1545, when the Spanish cut a notch in the rim and lowered the water level enough to recover some gold pieces. But this was just the beginning of what would become centuries of attempts to drain the lake, each more elaborate than the last, each convinced that previous failures had simply lacked sufficient engineering capacity or determination. In 1628, a merchant named Sepulveda organised a much larger operation. He employed indigenous labour to cut a deeper channel through the rim of the lake, managing to lower the water level by approximately 20 metres. The exposed mud yielded some gold objects, enough to excite the investors but nowhere near enough to repay the costs of the operation. More importantly, the mud itself proved almost impossible to work with. Thick, viscous, dangerous, swallowing workers who tried to search it thoroughly, and when the rains came, the lake refilled faster than they could work, undoing months of effort in a matter of days. The pattern repeated through the centuries. Another attempt in the 1600s, another in 1740. Each time the engineering improved slightly, the water level dropped a bit further, some gold was recovered, but never enough to justify the enormous expense and effort. The lake guarded its treasures not through supernatural protection, but through simple physics and geology. It was deep, the mud at the bottom was nearly impossible to search properly, and the water wanted to refill its natural basin. The most ambitious attempt came in 1898, when a British company called Contractors Limited took on the project with modern industrial equipment. They were no longer trying to partially drain the lake, but to drain it completely, to empty it entirely and harvest everything from the lake bed. They brought in heavy machinery, constructed an elaborate drainage tunnel bored directly through the bedrock of the lake's rim, employed hundreds of workers, spent enormous amounts of money. And they succeeded, at least technically. The lake drained completely, emptying through the tunnel until only mud remained, acres of exposed lake bed waiting to be searched. The investors must have felt triumphant, must have imagined that they'd finally solved the problem that had defeated everyone before them. But the mud, as it dried in the tropical sun, hardened to the consistency of concrete, becoming virtually impossible to excavate with the tools they had available. They managed to recover some gold pieces before the operations had to be suspended, a few tunjos, some worked gold objects, enough to confirm that yes, the Muisca had thrown offerings into the lake, but the total value was perhaps a few £1,000s, nowhere near the cost of the drainage tunnel and the industrial operation they'd mounted. The company went bankrupt, the tunnel was abandoned, and gradually Lake Guatavita refilled, reclaiming its secrets once more. The lake today is protected as a cultural and ecological site, with drainage attempts forbidden by law. The Colombian government recognizes it as sacred to the indigenous Muisca heritage and as an important source for understanding pre-Columbian culture. The few objects that were recovered from various drainage attempts are in museums, studied by archaeologists interested in Muisca religious practices rather than treasure hunters interested in gold. The full story of what lies at the bottom of Lake Guatavita will probably never be known. Modern archaeological techniques could map the lake bed without draining it, using sonar and other remote sensing technologies, but there's little motivation for such a project. The lake's importance isn't in how much gold it contains, but in what it tells us about Muisca spirituality, about a culture that created beauty specifically to give it away, that understood the sacred as something requiring sacrifice rather than accumulation. The attempts to drain the lake tell their own story. A microcosm of the larger El Dorado legend. They show European and later modern obsession with quantifying and extracting wealth, with turning spiritual practices into commercial opportunities. They show the persistent belief that the Muisca must have thrown away vast quantities of gold, that the offerings must have been enormously valuable, that recovering them would be worth any effort. But they also show, again and again, that reality can't match the legend. That the actual treasure was always less than imagined, that the cost of pursuit always exceeded the value of what was found. The lake wasn't hiding a fortune in gold. It was hiding the accumulated offerings of a people who understood that some things gain value by being irretrievable, that the sacred exists in the space between human desire and human reach, that not everything worth having can be owned or extracted or turned into profit. To truly understand the El Dorado legend, we need to look beyond the Spanish fantasies and later European obsessions to see the Muisca people themselves, not as supporting characters in a treasure story, but as the sophisticated culture they actually were, a society that thrived in the highlands of Colombia for centuries before the conquest shattered their world. The Muisca weren't a single unified empire, but a confederation of two main groups, the Zipa and the Zake, each with their own territory, political structure, and centres of power. These weren't primitive tribal societies, but complex chiefdoms with populations numbering in the hundreds of thousands, with extensive trade networks, sophisticated agriculture, and rich ceremonial and spiritual lives. They developed intensive farming techniques that allowed them to support large populations in the highland valleys, cultivating potatoes, quinoa, corn, and other crops on terraced fields that still mark the landscape today. Their society was highly stratified, with clear distinctions between rulers, priests, warriors, craftspeople, farmers, and slaves. The rulers, whether Zipa or Zek, wielded both political and religious authority, serving as intermediaries between the human community and the divine powers that controlled fertility, weather, and cosmic order. The priests who served under them maintained complex calendrical systems, conducted ceremonies that marked agricultural and astronomical cycles, preserved sacred knowledge passed down through generations. The Muisca built substantial settlements, though not the kind of monumental stone architecture the Spanish associated with advanced civilization. Their buildings were primarily wood and thatch, materials that have mostly decomposed in the centuries since conquest, leaving behind earthworks and ceremonial sites, but few standing structures. This absence of visible ruins allowed the Spanish and later observers to underestimate Muisca's sophistication, to see them as primitive because they didn't build in stone, to miss the complexity of a society that expressed itself through different materials and different architectural priorities. Their trade networks were extensive, reaching from the highlands where they lived down to the lowlands of the Amazon basin and up to the Caribbean coast. They traded salt, which they produced from highland brine springs, and emeralds, which they mined from deposits near Muso and Chivor. In exchange, they received gold from lowland peoples, cotton from warmer climates, coca leaves from the eastern slopes, shells from the coast, creating a web of economic relationships that connected diverse ecological zones and cultural groups. The goldsmiths among the Muisca achieved remarkable technical sophistication, developing metallurgical techniques that produced objects of delicate beauty. They worked primarily with tumbaga, an alloy of gold and copper that could be shaped more easily than pure gold and that could be surface treated to create a rich golden colour. They mastered lost wax casting, a technique that allowed them to create intricate hollow forms, small sculptures so detailed that modern goldsmiths study them with admiration. But here's what matters for understanding El Dorado. The Muisca didn't value gold the way the Spanish did. Gold wasn't currency for them, wasn't a measure of wealth or a medium of exchange. They couldn't eat it, couldn't make tools from it since it's too soft for practical use, couldn't build with it. Its value was entirely symbolic, spiritual, aesthetic. They treasured it for its beauty, for its incorruptibility, for the way it caught and reflected light. All properties that made it perfect for offerings to the gods, but useless for accumulating material power. This fundamental difference in how gold was understood meant the Spanish and the Muisca were talking past each other from the moment of first contact. The Spanish saw gold and thought wealth, power, success. The Muisca saw gold and thought sacred, beautiful, appropriate for offerings. When the Spanish demanded gold, the Muisca initially gave them worked pieces from temples and offerings, trying to appease these violent strangers. When these offerings weren't enough, when the Spanish kept demanding more, the Muisca were confused. They'd given away sacred objects, made enormous spiritual sacrifices, and the Spanish just wanted more, always more, never satisfied. The Muisca social order depended on reciprocity, on relationships of mutual obligation between rulers and ruled, between communities, between the human world and the divine. The ruler who covered himself in gold and dove into Lake Guatavita was demonstrating this reciprocity, showing that he understood his power came from the gods and required offerings in return. That authority meant responsibility to maintain cosmic balance. The gold washing from his body symbolized this understanding, a visible metaphor for the invisible relationships that held the world together. The Spanish conquest shattered this world with horrifying speed. The diseases Europeans brought with them killed vast numbers of Muisca, perhaps 70 to 90% of the population, within a few decades of contact. The survivors faced a collapsed social order. Their religious practices banned or driven underground. Their political structures destroyed and replaced with Spanish colonial administration. Their land divided among conquistadors as encomiendas where indigenous people laboured for foreign masters. Within 2 generations, the Muisca Confederation had ceased to exist as a functioning society. The knowledge of their ceremonies, their spiritual beliefs, their historical traditions. Much of this was lost as the old priest died without being able to pass their knowledge to new generations. What survived did so fragmentarily, in memories and practices that went underground, in cultural elements that persisted despite colonization, in the landscape itself which still bears Muisca place names and sacred sites. The Spanish conquest of the Muisca was brutally efficient, accomplished within a few years of first contact in 1536. But while the Spanish conquered Muisca territory and extracted Muisca gold, they never really understood Muisca culture, never grasped the worldview that made the ceremonial offerings and the golden chief make sense within their original context. This failure of understanding is central to how El Dorado transformed from religious ceremony to treasure legend. The fundamental misunderstanding involved the nature of offerings. To the Spanish, offerings were transactions, payments made to supernatural powers in exchange for benefits. You gave the church gold or silver, and in return you received prayers for your soul, blessings on your endeavours, a better seat in the afterlife. The relationship was commercial, based on exchange of value, understandable within a framework of cost and benefit. The Muisca understanding was different, more complex, rooted in a cosmology where the universe operated through reciprocal relationships between seen and unseen powers, where maintaining balance required constant attention to the needs of the sacred, where offerings weren't payments but communications, gestures of respect and acknowledgement of dependency. The gold thrown into Lake Guatavita wasn't buying favour from the goddess but honouring her, feeding her, maintaining the relationship that allowed the human world to exist in harmony with the divine. In this worldview, the value of an offering lay precisely in its removal from human use, in the sacrifice it represented. An object that could be recovered, traded, melted down and reused wasn't truly an offering but merely a loan. A temporary display of devotion that could be recalled when convenient. True offerings required permanent separation, which is why the Muisca threw gold into lakes too deep to easily retrieve, buried precious objects in remote caves, placed them in springs and rivers where they'd be swept away or buried by silt. The difficulty of recovery wasn't an unfortunate side effect, but the entire point. Proof that the offering was genuine, that the sacrifice was real. The Spanish saw this practice and understood it only as waste, as primitive people too ignorant to accumulate wealth properly, throwing away treasure that could have been put to productive use. They couldn't or wouldn't understand that productive use, from a Muisca perspective, was exactly what the offerings accomplished. They produced cosmic balance, maintained fertility, ensured the continuing order of the world. From a Muisca viewpoint, the Spanish obsession with accumulating gold was the irrational behaviour, hoarding dead metal while neglecting the spiritual obligations that actually mattered. This clash of worldviews extended to concepts of wealth itself. For the Spanish, wealth meant accumulation. The more gold you had, the wealthier you were. Wealth was individual or familial, something you gathered and protected and passed to your heirs. Wealth was power, the means to command labour, purchase goods, influence politics. Wealth was the point, the goal that justified suffering and risk. For the Muisca, wealth was more complex and less individual. Yes, rulers and nobles possessed more gold than commoners, but their possession came with obligations. They were expected to redistribute wealth through feasts and ceremonies, to sponsor craftspeople and festivals, to make offerings on behalf of their communities. Wealth was social, something that flowed through networks of relationships rather than pooling in individual hands. A ruler who hoarded gold while failing to fulfill redistributive obligations would be seen as failing in his role, neglecting the reciprocal responsibilities that made his authority legitimate. The Spanish also misunderstood Muisca political structure, seeing centralized empires where the reality was more federated and fluid. The Zipa and the Zake were powerful rulers, true, but their power depended on maintaining alliances with subordinate chiefs, on fulfilling ceremonial obligations, on demonstrating both generosity and sacred connection to divine powers. They couldn't simply command and expect obedience the way Spanish kings could with their subjects. Muisca politics involved constant negotiation, gift-giving, demonstration of spiritual authority. This meant the Spanish search for a single golden king, for an emperor who controlled all the gold of a unified kingdom, was based on a fundamental misreading of how Muisca society actually operated. There was no single repository of wealth, no central treasury, no palace stuffed with gold. Whatever gold the Muisca possessed was distributed, some held by rulers and nobles, some in temples, much of it already transformed into offerings scattered across numerous sacred sites. The spiritual practices the Spanish witnessed and failed to understand were deeply embedded in Muisca cosmology. The ceremony at Lake Guatavita wasn't an isolated ritual, but part of a larger system of beliefs about the relationship between water, gold, and divine power. The Muisca saw certain lakes as portals to an underworld where powerful goddesses dwelt, beings who controlled fertility and abundance, but who could also cause drought and disaster if not properly honoured. The offerings thrown into lakes were feeding these goddesses, maintaining relationships that the entire community depended on. Gold's role in these ceremonies related to its physical properties. It didn't tarnish or decay, it caught and reflected light beautifully. Its malleability allowed craftspeople to create intricate forms. These properties made it symbolically perfect for communicating with divine powers, for creating objects that could bridge the gap between earthly and sacred, for making offerings that would endure in the underwater realm of the goddesses. The Spanish saw only the material value of gold and missed its symbolic and spiritual significance entirely. Even the language barrier contributed to misunderstanding. The Spanish interrogated Muisca informants through translators who themselves imperfectly understood Muisca's spiritual concepts, trying to render complex cosmological ideas into Spanish terms that mapped poorly onto the original meanings. What might have been a nuanced explanation of sacred obligations and reciprocal relationships could easily become, in translation, a simple statement about gold being thrown into lakes, the complexity stripped away, leaving only the detail the Spanish cared about. Let's think more deeply about gold itself, about what this metal meant and means, about how its physical properties have shaped its role across cultures, and why the Muisca and Spanish responded to it so differently despite both treasuring it. Understanding gold helps us understand why the gap between Muisca offerings and Spanish treasure-seeking was ultimately unbridgeable. Why the two cultures could look at the same metal and see completely different things. gold is remarkably rare in the Earth's crust, making up only about 4 parts per billion of the planet's outer layers. This scarcity is cosmological in origin. Gold atoms are created only in the hearts of dying stars, in supernovae and colliding neutron stars. Rare cosmic events that forge heavy elements and scatter them into space. Every atom of gold on Earth was created billions of years ago in stellar catastrophes, drifted through space, and eventually coalesced into our planet when the solar system formed. This means every gold object ever made, from Muisca tunjos to Spanish coins to modern wedding rings, is literally made of stardust. Fragments of dead stars shaped into forms we find beautiful or useful. The metal's physical properties contribute to its universal appeal across cultures. Gold doesn't tarnish or corrode under normal conditions, maintaining its luster indefinitely. Objects made from gold thousands of years ago still gleam as if newly polished, giving the metal an association with immortality, with permanence in a world where most things decay and fade. This property made it spiritually significant to the Muisca. An offering made from gold would endure at the bottom of Lake Guatavita forever, never rusting, never dissolving. A permanent communication with the goddess dwelling below. Gold is also remarkably malleable and ductile. A single gram can be hammered into a sheet 1 square metre in area, or drawn into a wire 2 kilometres long. This workability allowed Muisca craftspeople to create intricate objects using relatively simple tools, to shape gold into delicate representations of humans, animals, and spiritual beings. The lost wax technique they mastered involved creating detailed wax models, encasing them in clay, melting out the wax and pouring molten gold into the resulting cavity, producing hollow sculptures that were both beautiful and economical in their use of precious metal. The metal's beautiful golden colour, caused by how its electron structure absorbs and reflects light, made it aesthetically appealing across cultures. To the Muisca, this colour connected gold to the sun, to light itself, to divine power made visible. When the chief covered in gold dust stood in sunlight at the centre of Lake Guatavita, he glowed like a second sun, a human transformed into something that partook of both earthly and divine nature. The symbolism was perfect. Just as the sun gave light and warmth necessary for life, the Golden Chief mediated between his people and the powers that ensured cosmic order. But gold's scarcity and beauty created a problem that would drive much of human history. It became associated with wealth and power, became something people would kill for, fight wars over, cross oceans to obtain. The Spanish obsession with gold wasn't unique to them, but reflected a broader European and Mediterranean tradition going back millennia, where gold had become the standard measure of wealth, the foundation of currency, the ultimate store of value. In this economic system, gold wasn't valuable because of its symbolic properties, but because of its scarcity and universal acceptance. You could trade gold for anything anywhere because everyone agreed it was valuable. Kings measured their treasuries in gold. Merchants used gold coins for large transactions. Wars were funded by gold reserves. The entire economic and political structure of European kingdoms rested partly on access to gold supplies. This meant the Spanish who conquered the Muisca weren't just greedy. Individuals, but representatives of a system that required constant influxes of gold to function. Spain in the 16th century was engaged in almost continuous warfare, maintaining vast armies and navies, fighting the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, battling Protestant nations in northern Europe, attempting to subdue rebellious territories in the Netherlands. These military endeavours required enormous amounts of money, which meant gold and silver, which meant extraction from conquered territories in the New World. The Spanish crown took a royal fifth, the quinto real, of all gold and silver extracted from the Americas, meaning the crown had direct financial interest in maximising extraction. Conquistadors like Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada were expected to conquer and extract wealth, sending a portion back to Spain, while keeping enough for themselves to become rich and powerful. The entire system incentivized the rapid, thorough exploitation of any gold sources discovered, with little regard for the cultural or spiritual significance those sources might have for indigenous peoples. So when the Spanish heard about Muisca ceremonies involving gold, they heard about wealth to be seized, about treasure to be extracted and shipped to Spain, about a resource that should be flowing into Spanish hands rather than being thrown into lakes or buried in mountains. The idea that gold might have value beyond its economic worth, that it might be sacred, that its spiritual significance might be more important than its material value, this was incomprehensible within the Spanish worldview, or at least was treated as irrelevant in the face of economic and political necessity. The Muisca, conversely, had no economic system that depended on gold accumulation. They used other forms of currency for trade, primarily cotton mantas, standardized textiles that could be divided and exchanged. Gold was too valuable in the spiritual sense to waste on mere economic transactions. It was reserved for offerings, for ornamentation that signaled sacred or political authority, for ceremonial objects that mediated between human and divine. Using gold for everyday trade would have seemed, from a Muisca perspective, like using altar vessels as cooking pots, a degradation of the sacred into the mundane. This fundamental difference in what gold meant created an unbridgeable gap between the two cultures. The Spanish couldn't understand why the Muisca would throw gold away rather than accumulating it, and the Muisca couldn't understand why the Spanish wanted to accumulate gold rather than using it to maintain relationships with divine powers. Each culture's behaviour seemed irrational or even insane from the other's perspective, yet each was entirely logical within its own system of values and beliefs. The remarkable thing about the El Dorado legend is that it didn't die. Even after centuries of failure, even after the metaphorical transformation that should have relegated it to cautionary tale, people continued and continue to search for the literal Golden City, convinced that previous seekers simply looked in the wrong places or lacked the right technology, or missed crucial clues that would reveal El Dorado's true location. The 20th century saw numerous expeditions into South American interior regions, some explicitly searching for El Dorado, others searching for lost cities that bore suspiciously similar characteristics to the Golden City of legend. Colonel Percy Fawcett's ill-fated 1925 expedition into the Brazilian Amazon was searching for what he called the quote, _2_, which he believed was an ancient civilization of sophistication and wealth. Fawcett and his companions vanished into the jungle and were never seen again, joining the long list of people consumed by the search for South American treasure cities. The development of aerial photography, satellite imagery, and later technologies like LiDAR has revealed that the Amazon basin contains far more archaeological sites than previously suspected, including large earthworks, causeways, and evidence of extensive pre-Columbian civilization. Some of these discoveries have been touted as potential El Dorado sites, though archaeologists familiar with the research emphasize that what's being found is evidence of complex indigenous societies, not golden cities, not treasure hoards waiting to be plundered. In the 1980s and 90s, treasure hunters using metal detectors searched areas around Lake Guatavita and other sacred Muisca sites, despite legal protections that prohibited such activities. Some were caught and prosecuted, their confiscated metal detectors displayed in museums as examples of modern treasure-seeking's continuation. Others presumably succeeded in removing objects from archaeological context, destroying scientific information in their hunt for saleable gold, repeating the pattern established by the conquistadors 4 centuries earlier. The internet age has spawned new forms of El Dorado seeking. Online forums where amateur investigators share theories about the Golden City's location, YouTube videos analysing satellite imagery for signs of hidden ruins, websites selling maps or coordinates to supposed treasure sites. Some of these are obvious frauds, scams designed to extract money from gullible seekers. Others reflect genuine if misguided belief that El Dorado is real and findable, using modern technology and careful analysis of historical accounts. The persistence of the literal search reflects something important about how legends operate in human consciousness. For certain temperaments, the metaphorical interpretation isn't satisfying. These are people who look at the historical accounts, the indigenous stories, the gold that really did exist, and conclude that something real must underlie the legend, that the errors of previous seekers don't disprove the basic claim, that perhaps El Dorado exists in a form different from what the Spanish imagined, but is nonetheless a real place waiting to be discovered. This mindset isn't entirely irrational. History does contain examples of legendary places that turned out to be real. Troy, which Heinrich Schliemann excavated in the 1870s despite scholarly skepticism. Machu Picchu, the _3_ discovered from a Western perspective by Hiram Bingham in 1911. Numerous Maya and Khmer cities swallowed by jungle and later revealed by archaeological investigation. If some legendary cities were real, why not El Dorado? The answer, which historians and archaeologists have established through careful research, is that El Dorado, as described in the legends, simply didn't exist. The Muisca ceremony that inspired the story was real, the gold offerings were real, the indigenous cultures of northern South America were real and often sophisticated. But a city with golden walls, streets paved with gold, a king who bathed in golden dust daily as routine rather than ceremony, the impossible wealth that the Spanish imagined, this never existed anywhere in South America or anywhere else on Earth. Yet knowing this intellectually doesn't necessarily kill the dream emotionally. The human mind is skilled at finding reasons to preserve beliefs we're emotionally invested in, at explaining away evidence that contradicts what we want to be true. Modern El Dorado seekers can point to the vastness of the Amazon, to the relatively small percentage that's been thoroughly explored by archaeologists, to the possibility that important sites remain undiscovered. They can argue that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, that the next expedition might be the one to succeed. From a psychological perspective, the continued search for El Dorado serves needs beyond the simple desire for gold. It offers adventure, purpose, a quest that makes life feel significant and exciting. It promises to overturn established knowledge, to prove the experts wrong, to achieve something previous generations couldn't. These are powerful motivations, strong enough to override rational skepticism, to justify continued effort despite repeated failures. The legend also persists because each generation encounters it fresh, without the accumulated weight of previous disappointments. Young people read about El Dorado and feel the same thrill that pulled conquistadors into the jungle. The same conviction that this time, with new technology or new information or better luck, the Golden City will be found. The legend renews itself constantly, finding new believers to replace those who've given up or died, maintaining its vitality through this generational turnover. As we move into the final portion of our journey, let's shift our perspective from the seekers to what was lost in the search, from the dream of gold to the reality of destruction, from European obsessions to indigenous experiences. Because the El Dorado legend had consequences far beyond the deaths of conquistadors and treasure hunters, consequences that reshaped entire societies and destroyed knowledge we'll never recover. The Spanish conquest of the Muisca, driven partly by the legend of the Golden Man, led to catastrophic population decline through disease, warfare, and brutal labour exploitation. Estimates suggest that the Muisca population, which may have numbered 500,000 or more before contact, dropped to perhaps 50,000 within a few decades. The survivors lived under Spanish colonial rule that systematically dismantled their political structures, banned or restricted their religious practices, and exploited their labour in mines and agricultural estates. The knowledge held by Muisca priests and nobles, knowledge about ceremonies, cosmology, historical traditions, and the meanings of the gold offerings that had inspired El Dorado, largely died with them. Some was recorded by Spanish chroniclers, but these accounts were filtered through conquistador perspectives, translated imperfectly, focused on details the Spanish found interesting while missing what the Muisca considered important. What we know about Muisca culture comes from these fragmentary colonial accounts, from archaeological excavations, and from cultural elements that survived underground and were later recovered by researchers working with indigenous descendants. The sacred sites where ceremonies took place were desecrated, their gold offerings stolen or destroyed. Lake Guatavita, sacred to the Muisca as the dwelling place of a goddess, was drained repeatedly in attempts to recover treasure, its spiritual significance dismissed as primitive superstition unworthy of respect. The tunjos that were recovered from drainage attempts and from other sacred sites were melted down by the Spanish or sold to collectors, removing them from cultural and spiritual context, transforming them into mere objects in museums rather than elements of living religious practice. But the destruction extended beyond the Muisca themselves. The El Dorado legend drew expedition after expedition into the Amazon basin, into territories inhabited by numerous indigenous groups who had no connection to the original story, who'd never heard of the Golden Man or Lake Guatavita, who were simply in the wrong place when conquistadors came through searching for treasure. These expeditions brought diseases, violence, and disruption even to regions far from Spanish colonial centres. The expeditions like Gonzalo Pizarro's and Lope de Aguirre's didn't just fail to find El Dorado, they left trails of destruction through indigenous territories. Villages were raided for supplies, people were enslaved as porters and guides, those who resisted were killed or tortured. The indigenous peoples who survived first contact often faced follow-up exploitation, as later expeditions used the same routes, as colonial authorities established outposts in regions opened up by treasure seekers, as missionaries arrived to convert peoples whose traditional ways of life were already collapsing under the weight of disease and violence. Even accurate information about indigenous cultures was lost, because conquistadors and treasure hunters weren't interested in understanding the peoples they encountered, except as potential sources of gold or obstacles to be overcome. The complex societies of the Amazon basin, about which we're still learning from archaeological research, could have been documented by literate Spanish observers. But most expedition accounts focus on the journey's hardships, on hunger and disease and desertion, on whether informants mentioned gold, not on careful ethnographic observation of cultures that would soon be devastated by the contact these very expeditions initiated. The drainage attempts at Lake Guatavita destroyed archaeological context along with spiritual meaning. The gold objects recovered from the lake bed could have told archaeologists much about Muisca ceremonial practices, about chronology, about cultural changes over time. But they were removed chaotically, mixed together, often melted down, their scientific value sacrificed to the immediate desire for extractable wealth. Modern archaeologists working at sacred lakes try to excavate carefully, recording exact positions of finds, analysing context, understanding that the information objects carry is more valuable than the gold they contain. The conquistadors and later treasure hunters had no such scruples. The loss extends to languages as well. The Muisca language, called Muiscuban, is extinct as a living language, though some words and place names survive, and linguists work to reconstruct it from colonial-era documents and indigenous memory. The loss of language means the loss of ways of thinking, of concepts and categories that existed in Muiscuban, but that can't be perfectly translated into Spanish or English, of oral traditions and poetry, and sacred texts that existed only in speech, and died when the last fluent speakers died. And perhaps most tragically, we lost the opportunity to learn from Muisca perspectives on gold, on wealth, on the relationship between humans and the sacred, on what makes life meaningful beyond material accumulation. The Muisca had developed a sophisticated understanding that some things gain value by being given away, that relationship with the divine requires sacrifice, that beauty can exist specifically to be hidden rather than displayed. These insights, had they been seriously engaged rather than dismissed as primitive superstition, might have enriched European and later global understanding of what wealth means and what purposes it should serve. The El Dorado legend, in driving the search that destroyed so much, reveals the costs of obsession, the price paid when desire overrides respect, when the pursuit of treasure justifies any level of violence or destruction. The golden city that never existed cost more in human suffering and lost knowledge than it could possibly have been worth, even if it had been real, even if the streets really had been paved with gold. For most of this journey, we followed European perspectives, Spanish conquistadors and English adventurers and modern treasure hunters, all seeking El Dorado from outside the cultures that inspired the legend. But there's another story, told from the other side, from the descendants of the Muisca and other indigenous peoples who watched their sacred stories transform into European obsessions, who suffered the consequences of expeditions searching for cities that never existed. The descendants of the Muisca people still live in the highlands of Colombia, though centuries of colonization, displacement, and cultural disruption have profoundly changed their communities. For many years, Muisca identity was officially invisible, subsumed under colonial categories that denied indigenous heritage unless people lived in specifically designated indigenous territories. But in recent decades, there's been a resurgence of Muisca cultural identity, with communities reclaiming their heritage, reviving traditional practices, and reinterpreting El Dorado not as treasure legend but as sacred history that belongs to them, not to treasure hunters. From indigenous perspectives, the El Dorado story represents a profound misunderstanding, a spiritual practice stripped of context and transformed into something unrecognizable. The ceremony at Lake Guatavita, if it occurred as described, was about maintaining cosmic balance, about a leader demonstrating his connection to divine powers, about offerings made to ensure the well-being of the entire community. The Spanish saw only gold being thrown away and concluded the Muisca were foolish, wasting treasure that should be accumulated. But from a Muisca perspective, the Spanish were the foolish ones, obsessed with accumulating a metal they couldn't eat, couldn't use practically, couldn't deploy in ways that actually improved their relationship with the powers that controlled fertility and weather and cosmic order. The Spanish hoarded gold while neglecting their spiritual obligations, disrupting sacred sites in search of material wealth, destroying the very things that made gold sacred in the first place. Contemporary Muisca scholars and cultural leaders emphasize that El Dorado isn't theirs to explain or defend, isn't something they owe Europeans understanding about. The Golden Man wasn't created for Spanish fantasies but existed within Muisca religious context, and that context was destroyed by the very people who wanted to find and claim it. The tragedy isn't that Europeans never found El Dorado, but that the actual Muisca world, the sophisticated culture with its own values and knowledge systems, was shattered in the search for a place that existed only in European imagination. Other indigenous groups whose territories were crossed by expeditions searching for El Dorado have their own perspectives, often focusing on the violence and disruption these expeditions caused. Many Amazonian peoples have oral histories of ancestral encounters with strange foreign visitors, armed and desperate, demanding food and information, taking people as slaves or guides, leaving disease in their wake. These stories don't mention El Dorado, don't care about Spanish treasure hunts, focus instead on the human cost of contact. Archaeological research in recent decades has revealed that the Amazon basin, far from being pristine wilderness, was extensively managed by pre-Columbian indigenous peoples who shaped the landscape through agriculture, constructed earthworks and settlements, and developed complex societies. Some of these societies collapsed before they could be properly documented, victims of diseases that spread ahead of actual contact, entire cultures disappearing before Europeans even knew they existed. The El Dorado legend contributed to this catastrophe by drawing expeditions into regions they might otherwise have avoided, spreading disease and violence into territories that should have remained isolated from European contact. From the perspective of indigenous rights activists, the continuing search for El Dorado represents ongoing colonial attitudes, the persistent belief that indigenous territories exist to be exploited for European or North American benefit, that indigenous knowledge is interesting only when it might lead to treasure, that indigenous peoples matter only as obstacles or guides, rather than as people with their own valid perspectives and rights to their ancestral territories. Lake Guatavita has become a site of contested meaning, where indigenous groups seek recognition of its sacred status, where the Colombian government tries to balance tourism with preservation, where some people still see only potential treasure rather than cultural heritage. The law now protects the lake from further drainage attempts, recognizing it as cultural patrimony, but this protection came only after centuries of exploitation, after the damage had been done. Some Muisca descendants have reclaimed the El Dorado story, using it to educate others about Muisca culture and the violence of conquest, turning the legend inside out to reveal the real story underneath. Not a tale of treasure, but a tale of cultural destruction. Not a quest for gold, but a demonstration of colonial greed. Not a mystery waiting to be solved, but a sacred practice that deserves respect rather than exploitation. This reclamation involves correcting misconceptions, explaining that the Golden Man, if he existed, wasn't a king covered in gold daily, but a new leader undergoing sacred transformation once in his lifetime, that Lake Guatavita wasn't a treasure vault, but a sacred space where offerings maintained cosmic balance, that the gold thrown into the lake wasn't wasted but deployed in the most important use the Muisca could imagine, maintaining right relationship with the divine powers that sustain their world. It involves asserting indigenous authority over indigenous history, refusing to allow the Spanish version of events to be the only version told, insisting that Muisca perspectives matter at least as much as conquistador perspectives, that the story of El Dorado properly begins and ends with indigenous peoples rather than with European seekers. And it involves a kind of patient explanation, offered to those willing to listen, that gold's value isn't universal, that what seems like waste from one perspective can be sacred from another, that the real treasure lost when the Spanish came wasn't the gold they sought, but the knowledge and cultures they destroyed in seeking it. As we near the end of our journey through the El Dorado legend, let's think about gold itself one more time, about what this metal has meant to human societies then and now, about whether we've learned anything from the cautionary tale of El Dorado, or whether we're still making the same mistakes, still pursuing golden dreams at cost we don't fully acknowledge. Gold remains central to the global economy, though its role has changed. We no longer use gold coins for everyday transactions, but central banks hold enormous gold reserves, treating the metal as the ultimate store of value in times of economic uncertainty. Investors buy gold when they fear currency collapse or inflation, trusting that even if money becomes worthless, gold will retain value because it always has, because human psychology consistently treats it as precious across cultures and centuries. But this economic function of gold is based on collective belief rather than intrinsic utility. Gold has some industrial applications, particularly in electronics, where its conductivity and resistance to corrosion are valuable, but the vast majority of gold ever mined sits in vaults or is worked into jewellery, serving no productive purpose. We treat it as valuable because we agree it's valuable, a collective hallucination that becomes reality through sheer force of consensus. This isn't very different from the Muisca treating gold as sacred. Both systems assign value to gold beyond its practical utility. Both involve collective agreement that this metal matters more than others. The difference is that the Muisca at least acknowledged that gold's value was symbolic and spiritual, that they were honouring divine powers rather than pretending the metal had intrinsic worth. Modern economic treatment of gold lacks this self-awareness, claiming the metal is inherently valuable, while its value actually derives from social agreement and historical tradition. Gold mining today involves environmental and human costs that would horrify anyone who actually calculated the total price of extracting and refining the metal. Modern industrial gold mining uses enormous amounts of water, creates vast quantities of toxic waste, can contaminate rivers with mercury and cyanide, destroys landscapes, and often exploits workers in developing countries who labour in dangerous conditions for minimal pay. Small-scale artisanal gold mining can be even worse, with miners using mercury to separate gold from ore, poisoning themselves and their environments in pursuit of a metal whose actual utility doesn't justify the suffering required to obtain it. And we're still searching for gold, still running rushes when new deposits are discovered, still willing to tear apart landscapes and displace communities for the chance at wealth. The Amazon basin faces ongoing threats from illegal gold mining operations that clear forests, pollute rivers, and bring violence to indigenous territories. These operations aren't searching for El Dorado in the literal sense, but they're driven by the same psychology, the belief that gold justifies any cost, that the dream of wealth overrides environmental protection and human rights. Indigenous communities fighting to protect their territories from mining operations understand something the Spanish conquistadors never did, that some places have value beyond what can be extracted from them, that leaving resources in the ground can be wiser than digging them up, that relationship with the land matters more than the gold beneath it. They're making arguments the Muisca might have made if anyone had listened, assertions that the sacred deserves protection, that not everything should be commodified, that some treasures exist precisely by remaining unclaimed. The parallel between historical El Dorado seekers and modern extractive industries is uncomfortable. We like to think we're more sophisticated than conquistadors, more rational, more aware of consequences. But when we look at how gold is still being pursued, at the environmental destruction and human suffering that gold mining still causes, at the way societies still measure wealth in accumulated gold rather than in sustainable relationships with the world, it's hard to claim we've learned much from the El Dorado cautionary tale. Perhaps the real lesson of El Dorado isn't about the folly of searching for treasure cities, but about the danger of treating any resource as infinitely valuable, about the costs of pursuing wealth without considering whether the wealth is worth what we sacrifice to obtain it. The Spanish destroyed the Muisca civilization for gold that quickly flowed through their hands and into European wars, achieving nothing permanent, creating no lasting benefit that justified the suffering. Modern gold extraction often follows the same pattern. Enormous costs for temporary benefits, landscapes destroyed for metal that ends up sitting in vaults or worn as jewellery, value created through destruction rather than through building or sustaining. The Muisca understanding that gold should be given away, should be offered to maintain cosmic balance rather than accumulated for personal wealth, looks increasingly wise from our vantage point. They recognized that the metal's beauty and incorruptibility made it perfect for sacred purposes, but that trying to own it, to hoard it, to fight over it missed the point entirely. The gold gained meaning by being released, by moving from human possession into the realm of the sacred, by serving purposes beyond personal enrichment. What would our relationship with gold look like if we adopted even partially a Muisca perspective? If we valued it for beauty and symbolic significance but not for accumulation? If we treated it as sacred in the sense of requiring respect and careful consideration before mining and refining it? If we asked ourselves whether the cost of extraction is justified by the actual benefit we gain from possessing the metal? These aren't rhetorical questions. Indigenous communities and environmental activists are asking them right now, challenging mining projects, demanding that companies and governments consider the full cost of gold extraction, asserting that some places should remain untouched regardless of what wealth lies beneath them. They're making arguments that sound surprisingly like what the Muisca might have said if the Spanish had been willing to listen, that the earth is sacred, that relationship with the divine requires leaving some things undisturbed, that true wealth is measured in harmony rather than in hoarded metal. We're approaching the final chapters of our journey now, the space where we begin to integrate everything we have explored, to find the threads of meaning that connect a 16th century Muisca ceremony to our own contemporary dreams and delusions. Because El Dorado, even as metaphor, even stripped of literal treasure-seeking, still illuminates something essential about human nature, about why we dream and how those dreams drive us, sometimes toward achievement, sometimes toward disaster. The dream of El Dorado wasn't fundamentally different from the dreams that drive people today. The dream of striking it rich, of achieving security and status, of finding the thing that will solve all problems and make everything worthwhile. We've replaced golden cities with different objects of desire, stock market windfalls, technological breakthroughs, political solutions that promise to fix broken systems, relationships that will complete us, careers that will fulfill us, achievements that will finally prove we matter. These dreams serve important psychological functions. They give us direction, something to work toward, a vision of a better future that makes present difficulties bearable. Without dreams, we might sink into passive acceptance of whatever circumstances we're born into, never striving for improvement, never reaching beyond our current limitations. Dreams inspire innovation, courage, persistence. Many genuine achievements begin as dreams that seemed impossible until someone pursued them despite the odds. But dreams can also blind us, can prevent us from seeing reality clearly, can lead us to sacrifice too much for goals that aren't achievable, or that wouldn't actually satisfy us even if we reached them. The line between inspiring dream and destructive obsession is blurry, shifts depending on context and outcome, becomes clear only in retrospect when we can see whether the pursuit was worth the cost. El Dorado shows us what happens when a dream becomes untethered from reality, when the gap between what we want to exist and what actually exists becomes unbridgeable, when we interpret every failure as requiring more effort rather than as suggesting the goal itself might be flawed. The conquistadors who died searching for the Golden City weren't necessarily foolish when they began their quests. They had what seemed like reasonable evidence. They'd seen other impossible stories turn out to be true. They were operating with imperfect information in a world still mostly unknown to Europeans. But at some point, each seeker faced a choice: accept that El Dorado might not exist or double down on the dream, find new explanations for why it hadn't been found yet, convince themselves that the next expedition would succeed where all previous expeditions had failed. Most chose the dream, chose to believe rather than to abandon hope, chose to continue pursuing what they'd invested so much in finding. And this choice, perfectly understandable from inside the obsession, led them deeper into jungles they'd never return from, cost them resources they couldn't afford to lose, destroyed peoples and cultures that had nothing to do with their golden fantasies. We face similar choices constantly about when to persist and when to let go, when to have faith in our dreams, and when to accept that our dreams might be leading us astray. There's no simple rule that tells us which choice is correct in any given situation. Persistence sometimes leads to triumph, sometimes to disaster, and the difference isn't always clear until events have played out. But the El Dorado story suggests some questions we can ask ourselves when we're pursuing difficult dreams. Are we willing to examine evidence that contradicts our hopes? Are we interpreting every setback as requiring more effort, or are we occasionally considering that the goal itself might be misconceived? Are the costs we're paying in time, resources, and collateral damage proportionate to the realistic probability of success? Are we pursuing this dream for itself, or because we've already invested so much that we can't admit we might be wrong? These questions don't provide automatic answers, but they at least create space for reflection, for reconsidering, for the possibility of changing course before we've spent everything on a quest that can't succeed. The conquistadors generally didn't ask these questions, or if they did, they dismissed the answers that suggested giving up. They were trapped by the logic of sunk costs. We've already lost so many men, spent so much money, suffered so greatly, we can't stop now or it will all have been for nothing. But this logic is a trap. Resources already spent are gone whether we continue or stop. The question isn't whether stopping would make previous losses meaningful, but whether continuing will make things better or worse. The conquistadors who survived El Dorado expeditions were generally those who turned back, who decided that living without gold was preferable to dying in search of it, who chose reality over dream even though it meant admitting failure. The dreams that drive us can be beautiful, can inspire us to achieve genuine good. can help us create meaning in a universe that doesn't automatically provide it. But dreams can also consume us, can lead us to sacrifice things that actually matter for things that don't exist, can blind us to the damage we cause in their pursuit. The wisdom is in learning to distinguish between dreams worth pursuing and dreams worth releasing, between persistence and obsession, between hope and delusion. El Dorado teaches us, if we're willing to learn, that sometimes the treasure we seek doesn't exist. That sometimes the right response to repeated failure is to stop searching and start questioning. That sometimes the cost of the dream is higher than any possible benefit of achieving it. The Golden City never existed, but the suffering in searching for it was entirely real. The lives lost were irreplaceable. The cultures destroyed can never be recovered. And perhaps the deepest lesson is that the Muisca understood something we're still learning, that letting go can be sacred, that giving away rather than grasping can be the higher wisdom, that some of our most beautiful dreams might be better honoured by releasing them than by pursuing them to the point of destruction. The Golden Man who dove into the lake and let the gold wash away understood this. He accepted the transformation and the letting go. Perhaps we could learn from his example, from his willingness to be covered in gold and then release it, to accept that some precious things exist only in the moment of their relinquishment. We've reached the final chapter of our journey now, the space where all the threads come together, where the story of El Dorado reveals its deepest meaning not as history or cautionary tale but as mirror, reflecting truths about ourselves that we might not otherwise see clearly. Because in the end, El Dorado was never really about gold or cities or geography. It was always about the human heart, about what we long for, what we're willing to suffer for, what we build in our imaginations when reality disappoints us. El Dorado exists, not in the jungles of South America, not at the bottom of Lake Guatavita, not on any map that geographers will ever draw. But it exists in the space between what is and what we wish were true, in the gap between human limitation and human aspiration, in the golden light that imagination casts on ordinary things when we need them to be more than they are. Every person carries their own El Dorado, their own vision of the thing that will make everything worthwhile, that will justify the struggles and disappointments, that will transform their ordinary existence into something glorious. For some it's literal wealth, for others it's love or fame or power or creative achievement or spiritual enlightenment. The specific object matters less than the function it serves, giving us something to reach toward, a destination that makes the journey meaningful, a promise that somewhere ahead the Golden City waits. This isn't entirely delusion. Human beings need direction, need to believe that effort leads toward improvement, that the future can be better than the present, that the struggles we endure serve some larger purpose. Without this forward orientation, without dreams and goals and visions of better things ahead, we tend toward despair and stagnation. The capacity to imagine what doesn't yet exist, and then work to create it, is one of our species' defining characteristics. The source of almost all our achievements from agriculture to spaceflight. But here's the paradox that El Dorado illuminates. The dreams that drive us are most powerful when they're impossible, when they exist always just beyond reach, when they can never be fully achieved and therefore can never disappoint us with their reality. The conquistadors could continue believing in El Dorado precisely because they never found it. If they had found an actual city and discovered it was just another human settlement with some gold but also mud and politics and ordinary life, the dream would have collapsed into mere reality. This is why we need to be careful about what we make our El Dorado, what we place in that position of ultimate value that justifies everything else. If we make wealth our golden city, we discover that no amount is ever enough, that the acquisition of money doesn't bring the satisfaction we imagined it would, that we're still ourselves even with full bank accounts, still carrying our same anxieties and limitations. If we make fame our treasure, we learn that recognition doesn't fill the emptiness, that being known by strangers doesn't create genuine connection, that the golden glow of celebrity is as illusory as the golden city the Spanish sought. The wisdom, perhaps, is in recognizing that El Dorado is a direction rather than a destination, a way of moving through the world rather than a place we arrive at. The Muisca ceremony at Lake Guatavita, if we understand it correctly, was about transformation and release rather than acquisition. The chief was covered in gold and then let it go, accepted the beauty of the moment and the necessity of moving beyond it, understood that the sacred exists in the gesture of offering rather than in the possession of treasure. What if we approached our own dreams this way? Not as destinations to reach and hold forever, but as transformative moments we move through, beautiful and meaningful precisely because they're temporary, valuable, because we engage with them fully and then let them go. The gold washing from the chief's body into Lake Guatavita represented not waste but completion, not foolish loss but sacred offering, not the end of value but its transformation into something that served larger purposes than personal enrichment. The expeditions searching for El Dorado were looking in the wrong direction. They thought the Golden City was external, somewhere out there in unexplored territory, waiting to be discovered and claimed. But perhaps El Dorado was always internal. Always a question of how we relate to desire and disappointment, how we handle the gap between dreams and reality, how we find meaning in a world that doesn't automatically provide it. The city we carry within is built from our values, our relationships, our connection to things larger than ourselves, our capacity to find beauty in ordinary moments, our willingness to let go when holding on would damage us or others. This internal El Dorado doesn't glitter with gold, but it's real in ways the external city never was, substantial in ways that mountains of treasure could never be, satisfying in ways that mere wealth and fame and power consistently fail to satisfy. Building this internal city requires different work than the conquistadors attempted. It requires honesty about what we actually need versus what we've been taught to want. It requires the courage to pursue meaningful goals rather than shiny distractions. It requires accepting that some longings can't be satisfied and learning to live with that incompleteness, rather than destroying ourselves and others in pursuit of impossible fulfillment. It requires the wisdom to recognize when we're chasing fantasies and the strength to let them go, to wash the gold dust from our bodies and watch it sink into deep water, beautiful and irretrievable and exactly where it needs to be. The story of El Dorado, properly understood, is about learning to distinguish between dreams that enliven us and dreams that consume us, between pursuits that create genuine value and pursuits that merely destroy in the name of acquisition, between the golden glow of imagination and the solid ground of reality where actual life happens, where actual meaning is made or missed. And perhaps that's the treasure that was always waiting, not a city of gold, but the wisdom to recognize that the search itself can be the problem, that sometimes we find what we're really looking for only when we stop seeking what we think we want, that the golden city exists not ahead of us in some unmapped territory, but here, now, in this moment. If we can only see it through eyes unclouded by desperate desire for it to be something other than what it is. And so we've travelled together through 5 centuries and across 2 continents, following the strange journey of a legend from its origins in a sacred Muisca ceremony to its transformation into European obsession, from conquistador dreams to modern metaphor. From the shores of Lake Guatavita to the depths of the Amazon, from Spanish treasure hunts to English expeditions, from literal golden cities to the metaphorical treasures we all seek in our different ways. We began with the question of whether El Dorado was real, and we found our answer, though perhaps not in the form we expected. The Golden City never existed, at least not in the way the Spanish imagined it, not with walls of gold and streets paved with treasure. But the ceremony that inspired the legend was real enough. The Muisca culture was sophisticated and complex, and the human tendency to transform what we don't understand into what we desperately want to find, that's as real as anything in human experience. The answer, as honestly as I can give it, is that El Dorado was real and unreal simultaneously, a place that existed powerfully in imagination, while never existing in geography, A dream that shaped the real world through expeditions and conquests and deaths and transformations. A story that reveals profound truths about human nature, even though its literal claims were false. Perhaps the truest things are sometimes the ones that never quite existed outside the human heart. If you enjoyed this slow drift through history and meaning, through treasure and loss and the space between dream and reality, a like and subscribe would mean a great deal. It helps these stories reach others who seek the same peaceful exploration, the same gentle way to end the day with learning and contemplation. And to those who've travelled with me before, who return to these quiet hours again and again, thank you. Your presence makes this work worthwhile, creates community in the space between speaker and listener, turns solitary contemplation into shared experience. Wherever you are in the world right now, whatever time it is, whatever brought you here tonight, I hope you found something valuable in this journey. I hope your breathing has slowed as we move through the centuries together. I hope your thoughts have quieted, settling like gold dust through water, spiraling down toward rest. I hope your body feels heavy and warm, ready to release the day, ready to drift into sleep, carrying perhaps a dream or two from the stories we've explored together. Look up at the night sky if you can, or imagine it if windows show you only walls. All those stars, all that vast darkness between them, all that space we haven't explored and maybe never will. The universe is full of mysteries we'll never solve, treasures we'll never find, golden cities that glitter only in imagination. And that's all right. That's more than all right. There's something beautiful in accepting that some things will always remain beyond our reach, that the universe is larger than our capacity to map it, that wonder exists precisely in the space between what we know and what we can only dream about. The Muisca understood this when they threw gold into Lake Guatavita. They knew that not everything is meant to be possessed, that some offerings gain their value by being irretrievable, that the sacred exists in the letting go rather than in the holding on. They made beauty specifically to give it away, and in that gesture they understood something about the universe that the Spanish, for all their ships and weapons and ambitions, could never quite grasp. Perhaps we can learn from their example. Perhaps we can recognize the golden cities we chase, the impossible dreams that consume more than they give, the treasures that would disappoint us if we ever actually found them. Perhaps we can practice letting go, releasing what we thought we needed, washing the gold dust from our skin, and watching it disappear into depths we'll never plumb. Perhaps we can find the city that matters, the one we build inside ourselves from quieter materials than gold, from peace, from acceptance, from connection to the world as it actually is rather than as we wish it were. Sleep well tonight, wherever you are. Dream, if you will, of golden cities hidden in jungle mists, of sacred lakes holding centuries of offerings, of people who knew how to make beauty and let it go. Dream of the city you carry within, the one built from your kindest moments and gentlest understandings, the one that needs no conquistadors to claim it because it was always already yours. And dream perhaps of letting go, of being covered in gold and then washing it away, of transformation and release, of finding treasure in the gesture of opening your hands rather than in what those hands might grasp and hold. Good night. Rest well. May your dreams be peaceful. May your sleep be deep. May you wake tomorrow carrying something golden from these hours we've shared. Not treasure, but understanding. Not wealth, but wisdom. Not the glittering fantasy of El Dorado, but the quieter reality of a life well lived. A heart at peace. A mind that's learned to distinguish between what matters and what merely glitters. Good night.